Ladies and gentlemen, please join us in welcoming the Gathering of Eagles stage, General Walter Kross.
Well, good morning, everybody. That's painful watching that. General Horner, Mrs. Horner, fellow Eagles, Colonel Hastings, class members, members of the GOE Foundation, and families and friends. Let me introduce myself. I'm page 77. I found out yesterday. And John Warden, I only signed under your name 3 times. So, John and I have been very, very good friends for over 35 years, and we recounted a story last night where I actually slept on I-85 in a rest area in his Honda, delivering it to Eglin Air Force Base from the Pentagon back in 1981. And I think that was the last time I actually saw you. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Major Heather Demas and Major Christian Williams, my 2 leaders who have taken me through this process. I really appreciate it very much. It's a great honor for me to be here. I do not feel worthy. I'm sure others have told you that. And I really feel more like the person who's just going to cover a particular subject. I'd also like to recognize Heather's parents, Bob and Peggy. Are they here? No, they're not here. Anyway, there they are. They're way in the back. Thanks. They helped me complete my signing process for all the posters, and I appreciate that. As I look out at the ACSC class, I remember my time here, class of 1975. I felt when I graduated that I really did have all the tools necessary for my next assignment, which was 6 straight years in the Pentagon, culminating in working next to John Warden. It's the combination of the tools that the Air University provided here, plus the experience of the first couple of years were very, very important. Those of you who are leaving, going to the Pentagon and other staff assignments, you're going to be what I call the Iron Major or the Iron Lieutenant Colonel. And you say, staff job, how good could that be? Can't wait to get back in the field. For some of you, the most important contribution you're going to make is going to be as the Iron Major and the Iron Lieutenant Colonel. You're going to have the courage to stand up to do what's right, and you're going to have tremendous essay to know when to play your hand for the country, for the Air Force, for your service. It's very, very important. The Desert Shield and Desert Storm, very decisive and very much worth studying and learning from. But it was really the consequence of things that occurred 10 years earlier. 10 years earlier in the Pentagon, we were confronted with the military reform movement. And this was a small cabal of congressional staffers, Congressional Armed Service Committee members, well-placed directors in OSD, and in particularly OSD PA&E. They literally wrote the defense guidance in an alternative way that would have been extraordinarily deviant from what we brought to the fight in Desert Shield and Desert Storm. It was based on Lenin's very famous quantity has a quality all of its own. And the very, very credible icons that were at the heart of this military reform movement would have abandoned beyond visual range air-to-air. They would have abandoned much of our precision-guided munition air-to-ground, which seems anathema today, but back then it wasn't. They were gaining traction around 1980, and they were going to take us into an area where we'd have a variant of the F-5 with an all-aspect AIM-9, devolving into a gun dogfight, and we would have, even beyond the A-10, we would have had a blitz fighter with a 30-millimeter cannon, a very Stuka-like plane. We would have abandoned AWACS. We would have abandoned all versions of the F-15, skinny down F-16, probably would not have ever had an AMRAAM, AWACS, J-STARS, any of those things. The heroes of that intellectual battle were our Chief of Staff at the time, General Lou Allen, our Vice Chief, General Bob Mathis, our Director of Budget, General Blanton, and the very, very intellectually powerful Major General Jasper Welch. We were able to hold off that battle and hence continue on the wonderful course that we have that really made its first statement in a very, very strong way in Desert Shield and particularly Desert Storm. So, Iron Majors were a big part of that. It starts with those point papers and staff summary sheets, but it goes into those kinds of consequences and those kinds of results. I mentioned before that I didn't feel very worthy for being here. I'm the token Desert Shield guy, in my opinion, and I would like to say this is the first time I've ever spoken about Desert Shield. Even when I was the Transcom and AMC commander. We were always looking to the future. We had already learned all of our lessons and we were doing it. And if I was to look at who otherwise might be on this stage, I would say the first name that would come to mind would be Major General Jack Griffith, who 2 weeks before I arrived at Transcom, which was a day before the start of Desert Shield, he retired after 41 years of service as the preeminent transportation officer in the United States Air Force. I would otherwise not be here if Saddam Hussein acted 2 weeks earlier. Very simple. I also need to recognize General H.D. Johnson, who was both the commander of U.S. Transcom and the commander of MAC at this time. The component commanders, Major General Jack Piatek of the Army component, which at the time was the Military Traffic Management Command, the Navy component, which was Vice Admiral Frank Donovan, extraordinary individual, and the MAC DO, Major General, later Lieutenant General Vern Condra, had a great impact. And two individuals who worked for General Horner at the time, Major General Ed Tenoso, the commander of airlift forces for him, and Major General Pat Caruana, commander of tanker forces, were just extraordinary on a day-to-day basis. Every one of them fixing things that were broken. Now, in the context, I'm not going to talk about, boy, we really had it tough. I wish we had everything we had today. I'm not going to do that, although it does kind of leak through a little bit on the wish list. Rather, it's all about bridging very, very important generational gaps And three things that I call to mind. Human nature in an organizational setting, that's timeless. That spans generational separations. And that does not change. It may be so predictable, it might be a 95% correlation in terms of predictability. It's something that's worth remembering. Human nature in an organization. The second one, and it rings through everywhere on all the bullets, is no organization knows about itself until it's truly stressed. You can pat yourself on the back for 10 years and come up short when the bell rings. And the last one, it's so hackneyed, it's almost worth not saying, and it absolutely bit us to no end. Train as you will fight. So, if anybody wants to present to you a compromise that will obviate train as you will fight, call them out, run the other way, ring the bell, because a compromise on that will never work. Okay, can I have the first slide, please? Oh, yeah, I'm going to have to stand over here. For those who have their own personal Project Warrior-based military reading program, I recommend these two books. The first is called The Candy Bombers. It is the single best definitive book on the Berlin airlift and everything around it. There are two members of the Eagle population, General William H. Tunner, who commanded the airlift, and Colonel Halverson, the Candy Bomber himself. No two people are more deserving as being the airlift icons of the 20th century. And you should know that he did the Berlin airlift using something that's in your coursework. And those are the principles of scientific management. He was a disciple of that. He was a workaholic, and he applied those very, very understandable and often modified principles. You know, they become the problem-solving method, they become all these other things, but it goes back to Frederick Taylor's Principles of Scientific Management. His book is the best, was called the best management book of the 20th century. And Tunner read it. He first applied it over the hump, then he applied it in the Berlin airlift, and it was a wonder to behold. The Berlin airlift moved 90% bulk, coal, and cargo. Only 10% were other goods like dehydrated milk, dehydrated eggs, those kinds of things. When you compare that to Desert Shield and Desert Storm and the types of things that we moved, it's almost incomparable. But the processes are not. The processes are very, very transferable and very, very scalable. And the second book worth reading is one called So Much, So Many, So Far, So Fast. And this was written actually by the historian, Dr. Matthews, at Transcom. And it actually is a fairly quick read. It covers everything, air, land, and sea. And it's absolutely an extraordinary read. It's pretty easy to read, too. It has lots and lots of data. Okay, next slide. Also, during the frustrations of staff work, no matter what level you're at, Pentagon, a combatant command, whatever, when somebody finally says, a bad plan is better than no plan at all, throw a net over him and pull him out of the room because he is absolutely dead wrong. A bad plan or an immature plan is highly deceptive because most people do not have the core competency of actually executing an O plan until you have to do it. And it can be a black hole that sucks you in, and it could be too late. You reach a point of gridlock and chaos, which is exactly what we did. Particularly, what was difficult about this plan, and I'm not speaking for the storm side, I'm speaking for the deployment side, the shield side. It was an immature plan. It had never had a transportation feasible conference that we have today, those kinds of things that produce a refined tip FID. It didn't have that. And consequently, the tip FID was actually filled with a lot of very poor data. Okay, let's look at 82nd Airborne, 101st Airborne, whoever the units were. It actually included ULNs for items that were no longer in the inventory. And it also omitted some that were in the inventory. The priorities were different. And when we reached the point where we sent forward our sync sent forward commander, he was confronted with reality, and reality never matches the O plan, and so he had to alter the priorities. And all that happened at a point where the O plan actually said that we would have 2 to 3 weeks warning, depending on how you counted and what you did. We really didn't have any warning, so we began this thing with a non-executable tip FID, and we were already 2 to 3 weeks late. And all the priorities were changing because O plans never match what really is needed when you get up forward, which I'm guessing was a lot of air, a lot of precision-guided munitions to stop the enemy in his mind as well as in his tracks. And so we didn't have a very experienced Transcom at the time. It was stood up in 1987. It took a year to get the furniture. And a little bit later than that, the war started. And we'd had a few walkthrough exercises, but that was about it. The day I showed up, we stood up the CAT, and we started to execute the deployment order. We only had 300 people. We were seriously undermanned. The first thing I had to do was to go over to MAC and beg for people, just bodies. We would train them. All through DOD, we were where you are, I consider you the long, continuous warriors. You are pretty much in a state of conflict all the time. That wasn't the case for us for our 30 years, as you know, 30, 35 years. Rather, we were fits and starts. We were spikes and long periods of training in between. I used to call it 97%, 3%. We were from Vietnam all the way to Desert Shield with very little stress. Panama, Grenada notwithstanding. They were heavy C-130 operations and not big strategic operations. And certainly nothing of this scale. And so we just didn't have anybody who really knew what to do, except for a couple of small cells who were very, very proud of this new thing that had started to be deployed. It was called JOPES. And that's the Joint Operational Planning and Execution System. I think we still have it, don't we? I see some nods. At this stage, it was a very, very immature, deliberate planning tool. We tried to use it as an execution tool. This was a time when we had WMIX terminals. I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember WMIX terminals, but they were like big, fat, dedicated computers that could run a couple of DoD systems on them. And you couldn't use JOPES unless you had a WMIX terminal and a WMIX-style printer that was dedicated to it as well. And we had set up this process where within DoD, Anybody wanted to go in to make a change, they could make a change. Not a very good idea. So we had those kinds of things. So the things that were missing were good IT, experienced cells in the right places. We did not have any of the 1990s type logistics and deployment expertise that we gained out of Desert Shield and Desert Storm. And we had 3 stovepipes, MAC, TAC, and SAC. The tankers were in SAC. So we did not have what we have today as air mobility. It simply did not exist. We went to war with the very aging C-141s, which started to retire about this time, actually, and the C-5A and C-5B, which are less than reliable in their reputation. And the Army and the Navy had similar type things, which we'll talk about. Next slide. Remember that thing, train as you will fight? Goldwater Nichols stood up Spacecom, also stood up Transcom. And the vote in the tank was 2-2, and the chairman had to break, he had to break the tie so that we could have a Transcom. But in the process, they compromised. And they said, well, Transcom, you can have wartime authorities for contracting and for holding TIPFID conferences, et cetera, but not during peacetime. So if you didn't do the TIPFID in peacetime, you see where I'm going with this. I won't go any further. So we did not have any transportation feasibility. We didn't have any authority, because if you didn't have it in peacetime and all of a sudden the bell goes off, it takes a while for people to start paying attention to you. Instead, they turn inward when things start going wrong, and they go to their services and use their service-based systems. And so all these things were working against us. There was a lot of distrust, a lot of chaos. On about day 10, because of so many changes being made, people trying to get into the system and alter their priorities based on phone calls they may have gotten from CENTCOM here or there, and then CENTCOM also changing priorities almost on a daily, not almost, on a daily basis, by necessity. JOPES went into gridlock. It became 12 hours behind, 24 hours behind, became useless. So we literally went to pencil and paper on day 12 of the deployment. And it is at this point that I have to mention one other gentleman who is, that would be on the stage if he was not resting in peace, and that's Lieutenant General Dane Starling, the J4 at CENTCOM. We got together on the phone and we decided to do a recovery plan. And CENTCOM was in charge. CENTCOM set the priorities for 24 hours. They froze those priorities. No matter what, they didn't change. And that's what we put into JOPES, and we put it in with the existing systems, DART, CAPS, ARC CAPS, FAST, other kinds of systems, and all of the servers that were service-based systems, GDSS, the MAC system, all these things that actually talked. Then we took all of our JOPES teams and we put them at CENTCOM, CENTCOM forward, here, there, out, the 35 onload bases, all those kinds of places, we attached them to the deploying units who didn't have any competency in this. They're competent in their primary mission. This is not a core competency, this is a secondary competency. And then they have high turnover and all these things working against you that we now beat down because we know about them. But at that time, we didn't. It was one surprise after the other. And it was 24 hours, then we built it to 48 hours, then 72. 96 hours took months to get to that particular point. But that's how we put the discipline in, got the trust back, and were able to get the flow going again. And then you used a lot of General Tunner's principles. 82nd Airborne, Green Ramp, everybody knows about that. Well, we did just like General Tunner. We reverse engineered it. We produced an airplane that opened the door every hour on the hour. 141, 141, C5, 141, and we kept doing that, and they would load it up. And then when they loaded it up, we'd get a floppy disk. That floppy disk went on the plane. When it got to the other end, that's what they knew it was on the plane. This was the era of floppy disks, not the internet. So anyway, we kept doing that, and they, we kept having people say, when do we stop? When do we stop? And our commander, H.T. Johnson, said, we'll stop it when the civic leaders from downtown get on the plane. And that's what we did. They got on the plane. That was the last plane that we sent there. Because the requirement was so difficult. People just wanted to send so much to guarantee success. The original requirement was something, let's call it 8 million tons. We ended up moving about 9.5 million tons, and it was all supposed to be there by 15 January. It was there later, like 26 January. But that's a little mission creep, and that's the way things are. Okay, this wish list of today's people and resources, if we had the C-17, we would have been 25% more efficient.